This isn't a fairy tale. For Elizabeth Morgan, it was a waking nightmare. She gave her husband, Maxwell Williams, 2 decades of her life, helping him build a billion-dollar empire, only to be publicly discarded for a younger woman. She was expected to fade away, a forgotten chapter in the great man's biography. But they made one catastrophic mistake. They underestimated her. They thought she was just the wife. They had no idea she was the one who held all the power. What you're about to hear is the story of how one woman turned the greatest betrayal of her life into the most spectacular revenge, using their wedding reception as the stage for her corporate coup. The late afternoon sun, the color of burnt honey, slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, glinting off the crystal flutes of champagne. From 34 floors above Chicago, the city sprawled out like a circuit board of dreams and ambitions. For 20 years, this had been Elizabeth Morgan's view. But today, it felt alien, a landscape from someone else's life. The champagne in her hand had long since gone warm. Its bubbles vanished. Across the cavernous living room, a space decorated in sterile shades of gray and chrome that had always felt more like a corporate lobby than a home her husband Maxwell Williams was holding court. He was a man sculpted by success, his tailored suit unable to conceal the raw, restless energy that had propelled him from a junior analyst to the CEO of Williams Holdings, a global logistics behemoth. His laugh, a booming sound that always commanded attention, echoed off the marble floors. He was celebrating the closing of the Oakhaven deal, a multi-billion-dollar acquisition that would put Williams Holdings on the cover of Forbes once again. Elizabeth watched him, a ghost at her own party. She had planned this event, as she had planned all of them, with meticulous, invisible precision. She'd selected the caterer, a Michelin-starred outfit flown in from New York, approved the floral arrangements of sterile white orchids, and curated the guest list of industry titans and their dazzling, hungry wives. She was the perfect corporate spouse, elegant, poised, and utterly silent, a beautiful, breathing accessory to her husband's greatness. Her gaze drifted to the woman standing just a little too close to Maxwell, Vanessa Mitchell. Vanessa was the company's head of PR, a woman half Elizabeth's age with ambition that burned in her eyes like a pilot light. She was all sharp angles and modern beauty, with a sleek black bob and a smile that was both predatory and dazzling. She touched Maxwell's arm as she laughed at his joke, a casual, proprietary gesture that sent a familiar shard of ice through Elizabeth's heart. This had been going on for 2 years. At first, it was just a whisper, a change in Maxwell's schedule, the scent of a different perfume on his shirts. Then came the late-night meetings, the sudden business trips. Elizabeth had seen the credit card statements, the hotel bookings for two in cities where Williams Holdings had no business. She had seen the way Vanessa looked at her husband, not with the quiet partnership of a colleague, but with the triumphant gleam of a conqueror. Elizabeth had said nothing. What was there to say in their world? A wife's primary duty was to maintain the facade. A messy divorce, a public scandal, it was bad for the brand. Maxwell was the brand, and she, by extension, was its silent, smiling guardian. So she played her part, hosting his dinners, smiling at his side, and slowly, quietly dying inside their gilded cage. The party began to thin out as evening bled into night. The city lights below twinkled, a sea of distant stars. Finally, only the three of them remained in the Bastille silent room. The catering staff moved with spectral quiet, clearing away the remnants of the celebration. A triumph, wouldn't you say? Maxwell said, finally turning his attention to Elizabeth. He loosened his tie, his face flushed with champagne and victory. Oakhaven is ours. They never knew what hit them. It was a masterful negotiation, Vanessa added, her voice a low purr. She moved to the bar and poured him a whiskey, her movements fluid and confident. She didn't offer Elizabeth one. It certainly was, Elizabeth replied, her voice even. She placed her untouched champagne flute on a passing tray. Congratulations. Maxwell took the whiskey from Vanessa, his fingers brushing against hers. He took a long swallow, his eyes finding Elizabeth's over the rim of the glass. There was something different in his gaze tonight. Not the usual casual neglect, but a cold, decisive finality. "Elizabeth, we need to talk," he said. Vanessa smirked, a flicker of victory crossing her face before she schooled it into an expression of faux sympathy. She took a step back, positioning herself near the fireplace, a silent witness to the execution. "I think it's time we were all honest," Maxwell continued, pacing in front of the window. This, this arrangement between us hasn't been working for a long time. We've been living separate lives under the same roof. It's a sham." Elizabeth remained silent, her hands clasped in front of her. She felt strangely calm, the way a sailor does when the storm they have been tracking on the horizon finally breaks. "I'm in love with Vanessa," he said, the words blunt and brutal. "I want to be with her. I want to build a real life, a passionate life. I'm tired of this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room, at Elizabeth, as if she were just another piece of expensive, soulless furniture. "I see," Elizabeth said, her voice betraying no emotion. "I've instructed my lawyers at Thornton and Beck to draw up the divorce papers." Maxwell went on, gaining momentum now that the hardest words were out. "They'll be in touch with yours. I intend to be generous. Of course, you'll be very comfortable. A clean break. It's for the best." He looked at her, expecting tears, a scene, a plea. He saw none of it. He saw only a strange, unnerving stillness. It was Vanessa who broke the silence, stepping forward and placing a hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "We didn't want to hurt you, Elizabeth," she said, her voice dripping with insincere sorrow. "We just couldn't fight this. Love is love." Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Vanessa, and for the first time that evening, a flicker of something raw and powerful surfaced in her eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was something far, far colder. "You're right," Elizabeth said softly, her words hanging in the air like frost. "You can't fight it, and one should always be honest." She stood up, her posture regal. "Thank you for your honesty. Maxwell, I'll await the papers from your lawyers." She turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing softly on the marble. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The image was already seared into her mind, her husband and his mistress standing together in the monument to a life she had helped build, looking for all the world like a king and queen, surveying their new kingdom. But kingdoms, Elizabeth knew, could fall, and they rarely saw the hand that toppled them until it was too late. The day after the party, the divorce papers arrived. They were delivered by a brisk, impersonal courier and landed with a soft thud on the antique mahogany desk in Elizabeth's private study. This room, tucked away in a quiet wing of the penthouse, was her sanctuary. Unlike the rest of the apartment, it was warm and personal, filled with books, antique maps, and the faint, comforting scent of old paper and lemon verbena tea. This was the one space Maxwell never entered, dismissing it as cluttered and unproductive. It was here that the real Elizabeth Morgan resided. She didn't open the thick envelope from Thornton and Beck immediately. Instead, she sat for a long moment, looking at the name of the law firm, Maxwell's Bulldogs, known for their aggressive, take-no-prisoners approach to corporate and divorce law. He was expecting her to hire a comparable firm, setting the stage for a bitter, protracted battle over assets that would ultimately end with her signing a lucrative but soul-crushing non-disclosure agreement. He thought he knew the game. He had no idea she was playing an entirely different one. Finally, she picked up her phone, but she didn't call a divorce attorney. She dialed a number that was not saved in her contacts, a number she had committed to memory years ago. It rang twice before a dry, calm voice answered. "Yes, Walter," Elizabeth said, her own voice steady. "It's time." There was a pause on the other end, then a soft chuckle. "I must admit, I was beginning to wonder if he'd ever be foolish enough to make his move. The Oak Haven deal. I presume the ego is sufficiently inflated." Walter Goodman was Elizabeth's grandfather's most trusted advisor, a man who had been the chief counsel for Bennett Capital for 40 years. Her grandfather, a legendary investor named Douglas Bennett, hadn't just left her a fortune, he had left her an education. While Maxwell had been learning to climb the corporate ladder, Douglas had been teaching Elizabeth how to own the entire building. He'd taught her about shell corporations, proxy votes, and the subtle art of leveraging power from the shadows. Sufficiently is an understatement, Elizabeth replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. He announced his intentions last night. He and his PR head, Vanessa Mitchell, he wants a clean break. He'll get a break, Walter said dryly, but I doubt he'll find it clean. The Elizabeth Trust is fully matured. Your voting shares in Williams Holdings now stand at 51.8%. The final block was acquired discreetly last Tuesday using the Northwood Holdings shell. He is, for all intents and purposes, your employee. Elizabeth closed her eyes, a wave of vindication washing over her. For years, following her grandfather's posthumous instructions, managed by the ever-loyal Walter, she had been using her inheritance to systematically and silently buy up stock in her own husband's company. It had started as a safety net, a strategy her grandfather had insisted upon when she first married the charming, ambitious Maxwell. Never let your security rest in a man's hands, my dear. He had told her, let it rest in a diversified portfolio and a controlling interest. Over the years, as Maxwell's ambition morphed into arrogance and his affections strayed, the defensive strategy had slowly morphed into an offensive one. She had watched him leverage the company to the hilt for risky ventures like the Oak Haven deal, all while feeling smugly secure in his own perceived genius. He never once thought to check the ownership structure of the myriad of smaller investment firms that held his company's stock. He was too busy looking at the headlines to read the fine print. I want to proceed exactly as we discussed, Elizabeth said, her voice now sharp with purpose. No sudden moves, no hostile announcements. Let him think he's in complete control. Let him file the papers. Let him believe I'm just a discarded wife preparing to fight for her alimony. And the wedding, Walter asked? A genuine cold smile spread across Elizabeth's face. Oh, he'll have his wedding. I imagine it will be the social event of the season. I want him to have everything he thinks he's ever wanted. I want him standing at the absolute pinnacle of his triumph. The higher the climb, the harder the fall, Walter quoted approvingly. I'll have the team at Whitlock and Finch on standby. They are the best in corporate governance and utterly discreet. They will represent your interest, not as a wife, but as the majority shareholder. Thank you, Walter, for everything. Your grandfather would be immensely proud. Elizabeth. He always said you had a better mind for this than Maxwell ever did. You just had more patience. After the call, Elizabeth finally opened the envelope from Thornton and Beck. She scanned the documents, the legal jargon a blur. It was a standard, if aggressive, proposal. He was offering her the penthouse, a lump sum of $20 million, and a yearly alimony of $500,000, all contingent on the NDA. It was a fortune to most, but it was a pittance compared to the true value of the empire. It was an insult disguised as generosity. She folded the papers neatly and placed them in a drawer. She wouldn't be needing them. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth played her part to perfection. She moved out of the penthouse and into a luxurious suite at the Peninsula Chicago, a move Maxwell saw as the retreat of a defeated woman. She hired a well-known but ultimately second-tier divorce lawyer, a man known for settling, not for fighting. They exchanged proposals. Her lawyer, on her instructions, made a counteroffer that was slightly higher, but still within the realm of a typical billionaire's divorce. Maxwell, blinded by his own ego and Vanessa's triumphant whispers, saw it all as a predictable script. He told Vanessa that Elizabeth was being sensible, that she knew she couldn't win. He was too busy planning his glorious future to notice the storm gathering on the horizon. He and Vanessa set a date for their wedding, a lavish affair to be held in 6 months at the historic Greystone Manor on the shores of Lake Michigan. The invitations, thick cream cardstock with gold leaf lettering, were sent to everyone who mattered in their world. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was having tea in her hotel suite, a package arrived. It was one of the wedding invitations. She stared at the elegant calligraphy, her name inscribed on the inner envelope. It was a final, breathtaking act of cruelty and arrogance. He wasn't just divorcing her, he was inviting her to witness her own replacement. A lesser woman would have torn it to shreds. A lesser woman would have wept. Elizabeth simply picked up her phone and sent a message to the wedding planner, an old acquaintance. "Dearest Genevieve," she typed, "I was so touched to receive the invitation. Of course, I will be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world." She then sent another text, this one to Walter. "The invitation has arrived. The stage is set." He replied moments later. "Excellent. All assets are in position. The board has been primed." They are growing nervous about Maxwell's cavalier leadership style post-Oak Haven. They are ripe for a change. All they need is a new leader to emerge. Elizabeth looked out the window at the city. It didn't look so alien anymore. It looked like a kingdom waiting for its true queen. The day of the wedding dawned with a sky of brilliant, unblemished blue, a perfect, pathetic fallacy for Maxwell Williams' mood. He felt on top of the world, a modern-day king about to marry his queen and solidify his dynasty. Greystone Manor was a testament to his power, its sprawling lawns rolling down to the sparkling expanse of Lake Michigan. He had spared no expense. A string quartet played Vivaldi as guests arrived. The air was thick with the scent of thousands of imported white roses, and champagne flowed from fountains flanking the grand entrance. Vanessa was a vision in a custom Vera Wang gown, a confection of silk and lace that clung to her slender frame. Her smile was incandescent, her eyes shining with a victor's light. She had won. She had supplanted the quiet, elegant Elizabeth, and now stood beside the man who controlled one of the country's most formidable corporations. Today was her coronation. The guest list was a who's who of finance, politics, and industry. Board members of Williams Holdings mingled with hedge fund managers and senators. They clapped Maxwell on the back, congratulating him on his beautiful bride and his recent business triumphs. The whispers about his divorce were just that, whispers, tinged with a grudging admiration for the man's audacity. He had managed it all so cleanly, so efficiently. And then, just as the ceremony was about to begin, a quiet ripple of shock moved through the crowd. A black Bentley, discreet and impossibly elegant, rolled up the long gravel driveway. The chauffeur, a man who had driven for Elizabeth's family for 30 years, opened the door. Elizabeth emerged. She was not dressed in black, the traditional color of mourning or scorn. Instead, she wore a bespoke suit of sapphire blue silk, tailored to perfection. It was a power suit, not a victim's dress. Her hair was swept up in a flawless chignon, and a single magnificent sapphire necklace, the legendary Star of Geneva. A Bennett family heirloom rested in the hollow of her throat. It was a piece Maxwell had always coveted, a symbol of the old world wealth and power he could never quite attain. She looked not like a woman scorned, but like a woman in charge. A hush fell over the assembled guests. Jaws literally dropped. Maxwell, standing at the altar, felt a jolt, as if the flawless day had suddenly cracked. He hadn't truly believed she would come. He had sent the invitation as a final, triumphant jab, a way to underscore his victory. He had expected her to decline, or better yet, to ignore it, confirming her irrelevance. Her presence here, looking like this, was an act of defiance he couldn't comprehend. Vanessa's perfect smile faltered. A flicker of insecurity, hot and unwelcome, coursed through her. This was her day. What was she doing here, looking so regal? It was unsettling. Elizabeth glided through the crowd, her expression serene, offering polite, knowing smiles to the familiar faces who stared at her with a mixture of pity and awe. She nodded at board members, men who had sat in her dining room, and praised her hostessing skills. She saw the questions in their eyes, the sudden recalculations. She took a seat in the third row, a respectable distance, yet undeniably present. She didn't need to be in the front row. Her presence alone was a statement that echoed louder than any protest. Throughout the ceremony, she sat with a look of placid interest, her posture perfect, her gaze fixed on the proceedings. She watched as Maxwell and Vanessa exchanged vows, her face an unreadable mask of cool elegance. When Maxwell said, "I do," his voice for the first time that day lacked its usual booming confidence. He glanced towards Elizabeth, but she simply met his gaze, her blue eyes as cool and deep as the lake behind them. There was no pain in them, no anger, just a profound, unnerving calm. It was the calm of a chess master who could see the board 20 moves ahead. At the reception, held in the Manor's magnificent ballroom, the tension was a palpable thing. The string quartet had been replaced by a full jazz orchestra, but the music felt strained, unable to cover the nervous energy in the room. Guests kept casting furtive glances at Elizabeth, who was holding court at a small table with a few older, distinguished-looking gentlemen. Maxwell recognized them with a jolt. Lord Ashworth, a major institutional investor from London, and Franklin Reed, the notoriously reclusive head of a Swiss private equity firm. What were they doing with her Vanessa? Now Mrs. Williams tried to ignore it, clinging to Maxwell's arm, her laughter a little too loud, her smile a little too bright. "Can you believe the nerve?" she hissed under the music. "Trying to upstage me at my own wedding. It's pathetic." Maxwell wasn't so sure. Pathetic was not the word he would use to describe the woman in the sapphire suit. For the first time, a worm of doubt squirmed in his gut. He had managed his divorce from Elizabeth with what he thought was ruthless efficiency, but he had managed it through lawyers and intermediaries. He hadn't actually spoken to her, not really, since that night in the penthouse. He had assumed her silence was weakness. Now, watching her command the attention of men like Ashworth and Reed, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. The traditional toasts began. The best man, a college friend of Maxwell's, gave a rambling, boozy speech. The maid of honor, Vanessa's sister, gushed about finding a soulmate. Then Maxwell himself took the microphone. He stood in the center of the dance floor, bathed in a warm spotlight, Vanessa at his side. He thanked their guests, praised his new wife's beauty and brilliance, and spoke of a future filled with passion and success. Then, in a move of supreme arrogance, a final twist of the knife he couldn't resist, he addressed the elephant in the room. "I also want to take a moment to acknowledge my past," he began, his voice smooth and magnanimous, "and to thank my former wife Elizabeth for her service over the years. Our divorce was amicable, and I wish her nothing but the best. Her presence here today is a testament to the maturity and grace with which we both handled this transition." He raised his glass. "To new beginnings." A smattering of polite, uncomfortable applause followed. He was painting her as the docile, accepting ex-wife, graciously passing the torch. He was putting her in her place. He handed the microphone to the wedding planner. Genevieve, who seemed flustered by the undercurrent in the room, perhaps trying to smooth things over, to play into Maxwell's narrative of amicability. Genevieve made a fateful, unscripted decision. "That was beautiful." "Maxwell," she said into the mic, her voice trembling slightly, "and it's so wonderful to see such modern sensibilities." She turned, gesturing toward the elegant figure in blue. "Elizabeth, you look so lovely. I wonder if you might like to say a few words as well, to wish the happy couple well." A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. All eyes swiveled to Elizabeth. It was a horrifyingly awkward suggestion, a social grenade. Vanessa's face went white with fury. Maxwell's confident smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. He had written the script, and this was not in it. Elizabeth, however, didn't look flustered at all. She looked ready. She gave Genevieve a small, reassuring smile. Then, with the poise of a queen ascending her throne, she stood up and began to walk toward the stage. The jazz orchestra faltered into silence. The only sound in the vast, opulent room was the soft, deliberate click of Elizabeth Morgan's heels on the polished marble floor. The walk from her table to the center of the ballroom felt both infinitely long and charged with an electric, oral silence. Every eye was on Elizabeth. The air, which moments before had been filled with music and chatter, was now so still and heavy it felt like the moments before a lightning strike. The world seemed to have shrunk to this one room, to this one woman in a sapphire suit, walking calmly towards the microphone that had just been used to dismiss her. Maxwell's heart hammered against his ribs. This was a disaster, a public relations nightmare. He shot a venomous look at the wedding planner, Genevieve, whose face was now a mask of pure horror at what she had unleashed. Vanessa stood frozen, her hand gripping Maxwell's arm like a vice, her knuckles white. Her fairy tale wedding was curdling into a public spectacle, and she was no longer the star. Elizabeth reached the microphone. She didn't snatch it, but took it gently from Genevieve's trembling hand, giving the terrified woman a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. She adjusted the stand to her height, her movements unhurried and deliberate. She surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the sea of stunned faces, the board members, the investors, the society swans, the reporters from business journals who had been invited to chronicle the glorious union. Her eyes finally rested on Maxwell and Vanessa, standing there in the spotlight like two statues in a diorama of their own making. She smiled. It was a warm, disarming smile that seemed to instantly put the room at ease. "Thank you, Genevieve," she began, her voice calm and clear, amplified throughout the silent hall. "And thank you, Maxwell, for your kind words. A clean break and new beginnings." These are powerful phrases. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the room. She was going to be gracious. She was going to take the high road, wish them well, and this excruciating moment would be over. Maxwell felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps he had misjudged her. Perhaps she would simply play the part he had assigned her. "I have always believed in the importance of new beginnings," Elizabeth continued, her tone conversational, almost intimate. "They are opportunities for growth, for reevaluation, for sweeping away the old and inefficient to make way for the bold and the new. It's a philosophy that applies as much to life as it does to business." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. She turned her gaze slightly, looking towards the table where Lord Ashworth and Franklin Reed sat watching her with rapt attention. "Maxwell and I shared 20 years together, and in that time I didn't just plan parties and select floral arrangements. I watched. I learned. I learned about the company he was building. Williams Holdings, a fine name, a strong company, a company built on bold moves and, in recent years, increasingly bold risks." Maxwell's blood ran cold. This was not the speech of a gracious ex-wife. This was something else entirely. "The Oakhaven acquisition, for example, Sasso," Elizabeth said, her voice taking on a new, sharper edge. "A triumph," Maxwell called it, and it was a triumph of ambition. But it was also a triumph that has left the company dangerously over-leveraged, a fact that has made many of our investors quite concerned. A nervous murmur rippled through the crowd. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was not cocktail party chatter. This was inside information being aired in public with surgical precision. Vanessa tugged at Maxwell's arm. "Make her stop," she hissed, her voice a panicked whisper. But Maxwell was paralyzed, caught in the headlights of Elizabeth's calm, devastating monologue. "Maxwell spoke of my service to him," Elizabeth went on, turning her gaze back to him. "And I did serve him. But what he seems to have forgotten is who I truly served. My primary duty was never just to my husband. It was to my family's legacy, a legacy of prudent, strategic investment, a legacy of protecting one's assets." She let a beat of silence pass, holding the entire room in the palm of her hand. "When I married Maxwell, my grandfather, Douglas Bennett, whose name some of you may remember from the founding days of Bennett Red Capital, gave me some advice. He told me to never let my future be solely in the hands of another. He established a trust for me, a discreet, private trust with a very specific long-term mandate." Her eyes locked onto Maxwell's. The genial mask had fallen away, replaced by a look of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He was finally starting to understand. The blood drained from his face. "For 20 years, Elizabeth announced, her voice as clear and hard as a diamond. The trust, under the expert management of Walter Goodman, has been quietly, patiently, and strategically acquiring shares in Williams Holdings. It has purchased shares through various funds and holding companies, Northwood Holdings, Argent Asset Management, even a small percentage through Lord Ashworth's firm here. She nodded graciously at the British lord, who nodded back. Maxwell was so focused on the horizon, she said, her voice laced with a cold pity, that he never bothered to look at the shareholder registry. He never asked who was behind the anonymous-sounding firms that were so eager to invest in his vision. She took a small breath, preparing for the kill shot. "So while I do wish you a new beginning, Vanessa," she said, turning to the younger woman, whose face was now a crumbling facade of disbelief, "I'm afraid Maxwell's new beginning will look quite different from what he imagined." Elizabeth's voice dropped, becoming crisp and corporate, the voice of a CEO delivering a verdict. As of last Tuesday, the final block of shares was acquired, which means that the Elizabeth Bennet Trust is now the majority shareholder of Williams Holdings, with a controlling interest of 51.8%. A collective gasp, like the sound of 100 lungs being punched at once, echoed through the ballroom. It was a sonic boom of shock and disbelief. "Therefore," Elizabeth concluded, her voice ringing with indisputable authority, "I am using my right as the majority shareholder to call an emergency meeting of the Board of Directors for this Monday at 9:00 a.m. sharp. The primary item on the agenda will be a full review of current executive leadership and a vote on the appointment of a new chief executive officer." She smiled one last brilliant, chilling smile. "Congratulations to the happy couple. Please enjoy the salmon." And with that, she placed the microphone back on its stand, turned, and walked away from the epicenter of the explosion she had just detonated. The charade was over. The unveiling was complete. For a long, suspended moment, the ballroom was trapped in a state of collective paralysis. The only sound was the faint, apologetic hum of the air conditioning. Elizabeth's words hung in the air, glittering and venomous like shards of shattered glass. Majority shareholder, emergency board meeting, new CEO. The phrases detonated one by one in the minds of the stunned guests. Then chaos erupted. It wasn't a loud, screaming chaos, but a frantic, high society implosion. The low murmur of shock exploded into a cacophony of urgent, hushed conversations. Cell phones, previously tucked away in designer clutches and suit pockets, were suddenly in every hand. Investors were frantically texting their brokers. Board members, pale and tight-lipped, were huddled together, their expressions a mixture of fury and fear. The reporters in the room were typing furiously into their phones, their journalistic instincts overriding any sense of social decorum. They knew they were witnessing the corporate scoop of the decade. At the center of the maelstrom, Maxwell and Vanessa stood as if turned to stone. The warm, adoring spotlight that had bathed them in glory now felt like a harsh, unforgiving interrogation lamp. Vanessa's dream, her triumphant ascent, had dissolved into a public crucifixion in the space of a 5-minute speech. Her Vera Wang gown suddenly felt like a costume for a tragedy. Her face, which had been a canvas of bridal bliss, was now a twisted mask of rage and humiliation. "Do something!" she shrieked at Maxwell, her voice a ragged, ugly sound that cut through the din. "This is my wedding. You let her ruin my wedding." But Maxwell couldn't move. He couldn't speak. His mind was a maelstrom of denial and dawning, terrifying comprehension. Elizabeth quiet, demure, predictable Elizabeth, the woman he had dismissed as a relic, a part of his past he was neatly excising. He had thought he was divorcing a wife, not a titan. 51.8%. The number pulsed in his brain like a migraine. It was an impossible, ludicrous figure. He was Maxwell Williams. He was Williams Holdings. He had built it with his own 2 hands, his own sweat, his own genius. How could she own it? His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to deny what had just happened. But all he saw were averted gazes, panicked whispers, and the predatory gleam in the eyes of his rivals. He saw Lord Ashworth give Elizabeth a respectful bow as she passed his table. He saw Franklin Reed, the Swiss financier, stand up and shake her hand. These weren't just investors. They were her allies. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst. It was a meticulously planned, flawlessly executed coup d'etat. Elizabeth, meanwhile, moved through the chaos with the serene calm of a galleon sailing through a storm of its own making. She did not rush to the exit. She glided, a portrait of untouchable power. She paused to have a brief, quiet word with her lawyer from Whitlock and Finch, a stern-looking man in a Savile Row suit who had been posing as just another guest. She accepted a glass of water from a waiter. She was not fleeing the scene. She was taking a victory lap. As she neared the grand double doors of the ballroom, Maxwell finally broke from his paralysis. Galvanized by a surge of pure, desperate fury, he stumbled after her, pushing through stunned guests. "Elizabeth!" he bellowed, his voice a roar. She stopped and turned to face him, her expression one of mild inquiry, as if he were a junior employee with a minor question. "How could you?" he hissed, his face contorted. "How could you do this today of all days?" "On the contrary, Maxwell," she replied, her voice low and even, for his ears only. "Today was the only day. You wanted a public spectacle of your triumph. You wanted everyone who matters to be in this room to witness your new beginning. I simply gave them a more accurate version of the story. This is my company, my life," he sputtered, his carefully constructed facade of sophistication shattering completely. "No, Maxwell," she corrected him gently, but with a spine of steel. "It was your company. You were its steward. And in my opinion, and more importantly, in the opinion of the majority shareholder, your stewardship has become reckless. You leveraged my company's future for your own ego." The use of the words "my company" was like a physical blow. He flinched. "I will fight you," he snarled. "I'll see you in court for the rest of your life." Elizabeth allowed herself a small, pitying smile. "You can't fight the numbers, Maxwell. Your lawyers at Thornton and Beck are excellent at divorce proceedings, but I suspect they're about to be out of their depth. My team at Whitlock and Finch, on the other hand, are specialists in corporate governance and shareholder rights. The bylaws are quite clear. The vote on Monday is a formality. You can attend the board meeting as the outgoing CEO, or you can tender your resignation beforehand. The choice is yours. Either way, clear out your office by noon." Vanessa had followed him, her face tear-streaked, her mascara running. "You witch!" she screamed at Elizabeth. "You calculating, bitter witch!" Elizabeth's gaze fell upon Vanessa, and the last vestiges of warmth vanished, leaving behind an Arctic chill. "You wanted to be the queen of this kingdom, my dear," Elizabeth said softly. "You should have done your due diligence on who actually owned the throne. You married a man, but you coveted an empire. You'll get to keep the man, I suppose, but I'm quite sure the empire was what you were really after." With that final, devastating cut, Elizabeth turned her back on the wreckage of their lives. Her chauffeur was waiting, the door of the Bentley open. She slipped inside without a backward glance. As the car pulled away, she could see them through the tinted window. Maxwell Williams, the titan of industry, standing dumbstruck and broken in the doorway of his own ruined wedding, his weeping bride clinging to the arm of a man who, in the space of an evening, had lost everything that truly mattered to him. The coup was complete. The reign of Maxwell Williams was over. The reign of Elizabeth Morgan had just begun. The Greystone Manor wedding didn't just end, it imploded. It would be forever remembered in the annals of Chicago high society as the Williams coup. Before Elizabeth's Bentley had even reached the end of the long gravel drive, the first news alert hit the phones of the financial elite worldwide. Bloomberg Elizabeth Bennet Morgan announces 51.8% controlling stake in Williams Holdings at CEO husband's wedding reception. Emergency board meeting called. The story spread like wildfire through the digital veins of the global economy. The Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Reuters, they all scrambled their top journalists. working the phones, calling every guest, every board member, every analyst they knew. The narrative was irresistible. The scorned wife, the public revenge, the corporate takeover. It was a drama of Shakespearean proportions played out in the world of billion-dollar logistics. By Sunday morning, the story was front-page news. Photos of Elizabeth looking impossibly poised in her sapphire suit were juxtaposed with shots of a haggard, stunned Maxwell and a weeping Vanessa. The market, which loves stability and abhors a vacuum, was already reacting. Pre-market futures for Williams Holdings, WHL, were in freefall. Analysts were predicting a bloodbath when the New York Stock Exchange opened on Monday. Maxwell and Vanessa spent their wedding night not in a lavish honeymoon suite, but in the sterile conference room of Thornton and Beck, surrounded by frantic lawyers. The Bulldogs were in a state of shock. They had been preparing for a standard, albeit high-value, divorce. They had not been prepared for a hostile takeover orchestrated by the person they had assumed was the victim. They pored over corporate charters and shareholder agreements, their faces growing grimmer with each page. "She's got us, Maxwell," said lead counsel Robert Thornton, a man who had never admitted defeat in his life. He looked exhausted. The share purchases are ironclad, routed through at least a dozen different legal entities over 2 decades. It's a work of art. Devious, but a work of art. The Elizabeth Bennet Trust is the undisputed majority owner. The emergency meeting is legal. The vote is legal. "So, what do I do?" Maxwell asked, his voice a hollow echo of its former self. "You've got 2 options," Thornton said bluntly. "You show up on Monday and get publicly executed by a board that she now controls, or you resign. I'd advise the latter. It gives you the tiniest sliver of dignity to walk away with." Vanessa, huddled in a chair wrapped in a borrowed coat over her ruined wedding gown, just stared into space. Her mind couldn't process the sheer scale of the catastrophe. She had hitched her wagon to a star, only to watch it plummet from the sky. The power, the prestige, the penthouse, the private jet, it was all evaporating before her eyes. She was Mrs. Williams, yes, but the name now felt like a liability, a brand associated with humiliation and failure. She was married to a man who was about to become the most famous corporate casualty in modern history. Meanwhile, Elizabeth spent her Sunday in quiet preparation. She was not at a spa or celebrating with champagne. She was into the boardroom of Whitlock and Finch, a space of quiet old-world power with dark wood paneling and views of the Chicago River. With her was Walter Goodman, who had flown in from Zurich, and her hand-picked legal and financial team. They weren't celebrating. They were strategizing. "The stock will plummet at the opening bell," said a young, sharp analyst named David Chen, pointing to a chart. "The market hates uncertainty. They see a family squabble, not a transition." "Then we will give them certainty," Elizabeth stated, her voice calm and authoritative. She was no longer the silent wife. She was the commander. "Walter, I want a press release ready to go out at 9:01 a.m. Monday. The moment the meeting is called to order, it will announce my appointment as interim CEO, effective immediately. It will also announce a temporary suspension of trading on WHL stock to prevent panic selling and allow for an orderly transition. The SE will grant it given the circumstances." Walter nodded. "It shows responsible leadership." "Furthermore," Elizabeth continued, "the release will announce a full, immediate audit of the Oakhaven acquisition and a strategic review of all high-leverage positions taken in the last 24 months. We're signaling a return to stability and fiscal prudence. We are not the chaos. We are the cure for the chaos." She turned to Lord Ashworth, who had joined the meeting via a secure video link from London. "My lord, I'll need you and our other institutional allies to make statements of support. Express confidence in the new leadership. We need to project an image of a unified, stable front." "It will be done, Elizabeth," the British lord said, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. The city was growing tired of Maxwell's cowboy antics. A return to Bennet family principles at the helm will be most welcome. The plan was meticulous. While Maxwell was drowning in the wreckage of his personal life, Elizabeth was already governing. She was shoring up support, managing the message, and planning her first 100 days. She had spent 20 years in the passenger seat, but she had been reading the maps the entire time. On Sunday evening, Maxwell Williams, a man who had never surrendered in his life, did just that. At 10 p.m., a single-page letter, drafted by his lawyers, was delivered to the offices of Whitlock and Finch. It was his resignation as CEO and chairman of the board of Williams Holdings, effective immediately. Elizabeth read the letter without a flicker of emotion. It was not a victory. It was a predicted outcome, a necessary step in her plan. She placed the letter on the table. "Get some rest. Everyone," she told her team. "Tomorrow the real work begins." As she was driven back to her hotel, the city lights blurred past her window. She felt not a sense of vengeful glee, but a quiet, profound sense of rightness. She had not destroyed Maxwell's life out of spite. She had reclaimed her own. She had protected her family's legacy and the future of a company that thousands of people depended on. She had simply corrected a mistake she had made 20 years ago. The mistake of letting a man believe he was the source of her power, when all along the power had been hers to wield. The aftermath was messy, but the power play had been perfect. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, a somber backdrop for the final act of the drama. The lobby of Williams Holdings Tower was a media circus. Reporters and camera crews packed the marble expanse, held back by a line of stoic security guards. They shouted questions at anyone in a suit, hoping for a quote, a crumb of information. The air crackled with anticipation. At precisely 8:45 a.m., a black Bentley pulled up to the private executive entrance. Elizabeth Morgan stepped out. She was dressed in a charcoal gray power dress, her hair styled in its signature elegant chignon. She wore no jewelry except for a simple, classic watch. She projected an aura of absolute, unshakable control. Flanked by her legal team from Whitlock and Finch, she walked into the building she now owned, ignoring the clamor of the press. The boardroom on the 50th floor was a place of immense tension. The remaining board members, a group of powerful men who had been Maxwell's allies for years, sat grim-faced around the enormous obsidian table. They had spent the weekend on the phone with their lawyers. They knew they had been outmaneuvered, and their allegiance, always a pragmatic calculation, was shifting towards the new center of power. At 9:00 a.m. sharp, Elizabeth entered the room. Walter Goodman was at her side. She did not take the CEO's chair at the head of the table. Instead, she took a seat in the center, a subtle but clear signal that this was a new kind of leadership. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice filling the silent room. "As you all know, I have called this emergency meeting in my capacity as majority shareholder. We have received and accepted Mr. Maxwell Williams' resignation." She slid a copy of the resignation letter down the polished table. "The first order of business is to restore stability and confidence in this company. Therefore, I am putting forward a motion to appoint myself as interim chief executive officer and chairwoman of the board, effective immediately." Walter Goodman, in his capacity as her legal counsel, seconded the motion. Elizabeth looked around the table, meeting each board member's eye. "Is there any discussion?" There was none. To argue would be pointless, an act of professional suicide. One by one, they murmured their assent. "The motion carries unanimously," Elizabeth announced, her tone matter-of-fact. "The press release confirming this transition and the temporary suspension of trading has just been issued." She then spent the next hour laying out her vision. It was not a vision of vengeance, but of renewal. She spoke with a fluency and depth of knowledge that stunned the board. She detailed the company's financial exposure from the Oakhaven deal, outlining a clear, decisive plan to restructure the debt and divest from non-core, high-risk assets. She spoke of reinvesting in the company's core logistics technology, of employee welfare, and of a new era of corporate transparency. She wasn't just the money, she was the mind. She had been studying this company for 20 years, not as a wife, but as an owner in waiting. Maxwell was a builder, she concluded, her tone measured. almost generous. But in the end, his ego outgrew his vision. Our new vision will be one of sustainable, profitable growth, built on a foundation of stability, not speculation. We will honor the Williams name by making it synonymous not with risky gambles, but with reliability and value. Are there any questions? A hand went up. It was Robert Chen, the youngest board member. What about Maxwell Williams' severance package? Mr. Williams' employment contract contains a standard morality clause, Elizabeth replied coolly. I believe his actions, which have caused significant reputational damage and jeopardized shareholder value, constitute a clear violation of that clause. Therefore, he will not be receiving a golden parachute. He will receive his vested pension as required by law, nothing more. The message was brutally clear. The old king was not just deposed. He was exiled, stripped of his honors and his treasure. The fate of Maxwell and Vanessa became a footnote in the larger story of Elizabeth's ascent. They retreated from the public eye, their names toxic in the circles they once dominated. Maxwell, without his company, his power, or his fortune, was just a man. Vanessa, the triumphant mistress, found herself married not to a titan, but to a pariah. Their new beginning was a quiet, bitter exile in a world that had once been their oyster. Weeks later, Elizabeth stood in the CEO's office. She had redecorated, replacing the cold chrome and gray with warm woods, comfortable furniture, and shelves filled with books. The view of the city was the same, but now it felt different. It was not a cage, but a kingdom. Her kingdom. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. You took everything from me. She knew it was from Maxwell. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old life, the ghost of the woman she had been. Then she deleted the message without replying. She had no more time for the past. She turned back to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below, a landscape of challenges and opportunities. The reign of Elizabeth Bennet Morgan had just begun. And so Elizabeth Morgan rewrote her own story. She transformed the ultimate betrayal into the ultimate victory, proving that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. Her story is a raw, gripping reminder that a person's worth is never defined by their partner, and that the best revenge isn't loud and messy, it's strategic, silent, and absolute. She didn't just get even, she got everything. What did you think of Elizabeth's masterful plan? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of epic revenge and empowerment, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that are stranger and more compelling than fiction. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update from us. But wait before you go. Let's dive deeper into what happened next. Because Elizabeth Morgan's story didn't end when she took over Williams Holdings. In many ways, that was just the beginning. 6 months after the infamous Williams coup, as the business press had dubbed it, Elizabeth Morgan sat in her executive office reviewing the quarterly reports. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space she had transformed from Maxwell's sterile showroom into a sophisticated sanctuary that reflected her own sensibilities. Gone were the chrome and steel minimalist furnishings that had made the office feel like an operating theater. In their place stood elegant walnut furniture, comfortable leather chairs, and shelves lined with business biographies, economic treatises, and classical literature. A collection of antique maps, her private passion, adorned one wall, while another displayed framed photos of Williams Holdings facilities around the world, each one she had personally visited in the past half year. The boardroom table that once dominated the space like an altar had been replaced with a more modest round table near the window, where she conducted most meetings. It sent a message under Elizabeth Morgan's leadership. Ideas flowed in circles, not hierarchies. The quarterly results before her told a story of remarkable stabilization. The stock, which had indeed plummeted in the immediate aftermath of her takeover, had not only recovered but was trading 15% higher than before the Oak Haven acquisition. The financial press, initially skeptical of a society wife taking over a logistics giant, had been forced to acknowledge her acumen. Morgan's steady hand guides Williams Holdings to strongest quarter in 5 years. Read the headline in the Wall Street Journal just that morning. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Diane Foster, the company's new head of PR, a seasoned professional with gray in her hair and decades of crisis management experience. Elizabeth had hired her to replace Vanessa Mitchell, whose office had been cleared out within hours of the takeover. "The Forbes journalist is here for your interview," Diane said. "Are you ready for her?" Elizabeth nodded. The profile had been in the works for weeks. The Silent Queen: How Elizabeth Morgan Orchestrated Corporate America's Most Spectacular Coup was the working title, dramatic, but accurate enough. "Send her in," Elizabeth said, closing the folder of financial reports. "And Diane, make sure Walter knows I'll need him for the McKinsey call at 4. Diane smiled. In the months she had worked for Elizabeth, she had come to genuinely admire her boss, not just for her strategic brilliance, but for her treatment of the staff. Unlike Maxwell, who had berated assistants and made executives wait for hours outside his office, Elizabeth was punctual, respectful, and precise in her expectations. Of course, he's already prepping for it. And the journalist who entered was not what Elizabeth had expected. Younger than she had anticipated, with a sharp gaze that immediately took in every detail of the office. This would not be a puff piece. Elizabeth realized this would be a dissection. "Ms. Morgan, thank you for making time." The journalist, Sophia Chen, began as they settled into the sitting area. "I've been following your story since that wedding day. I think everyone in financial journalism remembers where they were when that news alert hit their phones." Elizabeth smiled diplomatically. "It was a memorable day for all involved. I imagine, Ashen." "Let's start with the question everyone wants answered," Sophia said, activating her recorder. "Was it always your plan to take over Williams Holdings, or was it a response to your husband's indiscretion?" It was a probing first question, designed to unsettle. Elizabeth had expected no less. The Bennett Trust, which now controls the majority stake in Williams Holdings, was established by my grandfather long before I met Maxwell, Elizabeth replied carefully. Its mandate was always to protect family assets. The strategy evolved over time, as all good strategies do. "So when did you decide to activate that nuclear option?" Sophia pressed. Elizabeth considered her answer. The true story was more complex than anyone knew. The Bennett Trust had initially been established as a safety net, a way to ensure Elizabeth would never be financially vulnerable. But over the years, as she watched Maxwell's leadership style grow more reckless, she had begun to see the trust as more than protection. It was leverage, responsibility. "I prefer to think of it as fulfilling a fiduciary duty," Elizabeth said. The trust owned a significant portion of Williams Holdings. When it became clear that the company's leadership was making decisions that could jeopardize long-term stability for short-term gains, action became necessary. The Oakhaven acquisition. That was a symptom, not the cause, Elizabeth clarified. The company was taking on unsustainable levels of debt to fuel expansion that wasn't supported by our core competencies. Oakhaven was simply the most visible example of that strategy. "And the timing," Sophia asked, her pen poised. "The dramatic announcement at your ex-husband's wedding to your former employee, that seems personal." For a moment, Elizabeth was tempted to maintain the corporate veneer, to pretend that the venue and timing had been purely strategic. But something in Sophia's direct gaze made her opt for a more nuanced truth. "The timing served multiple purposes," she admitted. "Practically speaking, it ensured that all major stakeholders were present in one room. It prevented Maxwell from controlling the narrative or mounting an immediate counteroffensive. And yes," she added, holding the journalist's gaze, "there was a certain symmetry to it that I found appropriate." Sophia nodded, seemingly appreciative of the candor. "The business press initially predicted disaster when you took over," she noted. "The stock fell 22% in the first week. What did you see that they didn't?" "I saw a fundamentally sound company beneath the veneer of high-risk expansion," Elizabeth explained. Williams Holdings has an exceptional logistics infrastructure, a dedicated workforce, and long-standing client relationships. What it needed was stability, not constant disruption in pursuit of headlines. And now, 6 months later, you've not only stabilized the company, but increased its value, Sophia said. How much of that is due to unwinding Maxwell Williams' strategies versus implementing your own vision? It's both, Elizabeth said. We've divested from several of the more speculative acquisitions, but we've also invested heavily in our core technology platform and expanded our sustainable logistics initiatives. The market responds to clarity and consistency. The interview continued for another hour, covering everything from Elizabeth's leadership philosophy to the broader implications of her takeover for corporate governance. Throughout, Elizabeth was thoughtful, precise, and occasionally wryly humorous, revealing a personality that had been hidden during her years as Maxwell's silent partner. As Sophia was preparing to leave, she asked one final question. What would you say to other women who find themselves in positions similar to yours, overlooked, underestimated, perhaps betrayed? Elizabeth paused, considering the weight of the question and the responsibility of her answer. She knew her story had resonated with countless women who had seen themselves in her initial situation, if not in her extraordinary response. I would say that power doesn't always look the way we expect it to, she finally replied. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's patient, and sometimes the person who appears to be merely supporting the structure is actually the foundation itself. I would tell them to know their worth, to play the long game, and to remember that the most effective moves in chess are often the ones your opponent never sees coming. Sophia nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. As the journalist left, Elizabeth returned to the window, gazing out at the Chicago skyline, a view she had once shared with Maxwell, but now commanded alone. While Elizabeth was rebuilding Williams Holdings into a model of corporate responsibility and sustainable growth, Maxwell and Vanessa Williams were discovering the harsh realities of life after public humiliation. Their honeymoon to the Maldives, a lavish trip that had been planned down to the last champagne toast, was canceled. Instead, they retreated to Maxwell's vacation home in Aspen, hoping to escape the media frenzy. But even in the rarefied air of the Colorado mountains, they couldn't escape the fallout. Maxwell's phone, once constantly buzzing with calls from power brokers, politicians, and fellow CEOs, fell silent. Former friends didn't return messages. Dinner invitations dried up. Even the exclusive Aspen Mountain Club, where Maxwell had once held court by the fireplace, suddenly had no tables available when he called. Vanessa, who had imagined herself ascending to the upper echelons of Chicago society as Mrs. Maxwell Williams, found herself instead with a toxic asset, a husband whose name now evokes snickers rather than respect. The financial reality was equally brutal. While Maxwell was far from destitute, his vested stock options and retirement accounts still left him with millions. The lifestyle to which they had become accustomed required tens of millions. The penthouse in Chicago, the house in Aspen, the villa in Antibes, the private jet membership. The staff, all of it had been sustained by his CEO salary and annual bonuses, which were now gone. One evening, 3 months after the wedding disaster, they sat on the deck of the Aspen house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold. It should have been beautiful, peaceful. Instead, the silence between them was leaden with unspoken recriminations. We need to talk about selling this place, Maxwell finally said, swirling the bourbon in his glass. The maintenance alone is eating through cash, and we're barely here. Vanessa stiffened. The Aspen house had been one of the prizes she had coveted when pursuing Maxwell, a showcase property featured in architectural magazines, a status symbol among status symbols. Sell it, she repeated, her voice tight. And then what, hide away in some ordinary house somewhere? Maxwell's jaw clenched. We're not in a position to maintain all the properties. Vanessa, the financial advisor, was quite clear. The financial advisor you hired after you lost everything, Vanessa snapped, the facade of supportive wife cracking. The one you needed because your brilliant ex-wife outmaneuvered you and took your company. Our company, Maxwell corrected automatically, then winced at his own words. It hadn't been their company for months. It wasn't even his company anymore. It was hers. It had apparently always been hers, and he had been too blind to see it. Whatever, Vanessa muttered, standing up and wrapping her cashmere throw tighter around her shoulders. I'm going inside. It's getting cold. Maxwell remained on the deck alone, staring at the mountains as darkness slowly claimed them. He pulled out his phone and found himself scrolling through news about Williams Holdings, something he did compulsively, masochistically, several times a day. The latest headline made his stomach clench. Williams Holdings secures major government contract under Morgan's leadership. It was a contract his team had been pursuing for years, one that he had assured the board was nearly in their grasp. Now Elizabeth had closed it, adding yet another success to her growing list of achievements. In a surge of bitter impulse, he typed out a text to her, "You took everything from me." He hit send before he could reconsider, then immediately regretted it. It was weak, pathetic, exactly the kind of emotional outburst Elizabeth would dismiss with her cool, calculated rationality. He half expected a cutting reply, or perhaps a reminder of all the ways he had brought this on himself. But no response came. Not that night, nor the next day. Elizabeth Morgan had deleted him from her life as efficiently as she had deleted him from his corner office. Back in Chicago, Elizabeth was indeed moving forward, not looking back. The morning after the Forbes interview, she convened a meeting with her executive team to discuss the company's next phase of growth. The boardroom, now redesigned with a long, oval table rather than the imposing rectangular monolith of Maxwell's era, hummed with energy as department heads presented their quarterly updates. The technology integration from the Jensen Systems acquisition is ahead of schedule, reported the CTO, a brilliant woman Elizabeth had promoted from within the ranks. We're already seeing efficiency improvements in the East Asian shipping corridors. Excellent, Elizabeth nodded. And the employee feedback on the new profit-sharing program, the head of human resources beamed. Overwhelmingly positive. Retention rates are up 12% from last quarter, and we've seen a significant uptick in internal applications for advancement opportunities. This was the company Elizabeth had envisioned: innovative but stable, profitable but ethical, a place where talent was recognized regardless of gender or background. It was the antithesis of Maxwell's boys' club atmosphere, where advancement often depended more on happy hour attendance than actual performance. After the meeting, Walter Goodman lingered behind. At 72, he remained sharp as ever, his role now formalized as special advisor to the CEO. The board is extremely pleased with the direction. Elizabeth, he said, his usual formal tone softened by genuine admiration. Your grandfather would be proud. Thank you, Walter, she replied, gathering her notes. Though I suspect even he would be surprised by how things turned out. Walter smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. Douglas was a brilliant investor, but he never had your patience. 20 years building this position, hiding in plain sight. It's unprecedented. Elizabeth allowed herself a moment of reflection. It wasn't always the plan, she admitted. When grandfather established the trust, it was meant to be a safety net, not a weapon. When did that change, Walter asked, curious about a part of the story even he didn't know completely. Elizabeth's mind drifted back to a particular evening, 7 years into her marriage. She had overheard Maxwell on the phone in his study, laughing with a board member about how he had outmaneuvered a smaller logistics company, driving it into bankruptcy so Williams Holdings could acquire its assets at pennies on the dollar. Dozens of people had lost their jobs. Families had suffered. Also, Maxwell could add another small victory to his empire. I realized Maxwell didn't see the human cost of his ambition, she said simply. He built impressive things, but he broke valuable ones along the way. The company deserved better stewardship. Walter nodded, understanding. And now it has it. As Walter left, Elizabeth's assistant reminded her of her next appointment, a working lunch with Regina Palmer, the founder of a nonprofit focused on supporting women re-entering the workforce after career breaks. The meeting was being held in a small conference room rather than Elizabeth's office, her choice. The organization's work aligned perfectly with one of her new initiatives, a program at Williams Holdings specifically recruiting and training women who had stepped away from their careers for family reasons. Ms. Palmer is here, her assistant announced. The woman who entered was in her early 50s, with a warm smile and purpose in her stride. Please, call me Regina, she said, extending her hand. And may I say, it's an honor to meet you. Your story has inspired countless women I work with. I'm glad something positive has come from it, Elizabeth replied honestly, though I hope most women find less dramatic paths to recognition. Regina laughed. Indeed. Still, there's something deeply satisfying about seeing someone underestimated step into their power so completely. As they discussed the details of their potential partnership, Elizabeth found herself genuinely engaged in a way she rarely had been as Maxwell's wife. Then, her role at corporate events had been decorative, not substantive. Now, her ideas and decisions had real impact. We've identified 20 women for the pilot program, Regina was saying, all with strong backgrounds before their career breaks, all eager to return but finding traditional paths blocked. I want Williams Holdings to be their opportunity, Elizabeth said firmly, not as a charity initiative, but because it makes business sense. We're losing out on incredible talent by adhering to outdated hiring models. Regina smiled appreciatively. That's exactly the approach that works. These women don't want pity, they want opportunity. By the end of the lunch, they had outlined a comprehensive program that would become a model for other corporations. As Regina gathered her materials, she paused. May I ask you something personal? Elizabeth tilted her head in question. After everything that happened with your ex-husband, are you happy now? It was a disarmingly simple question, and one that few people in Elizabeth's world would dare to ask. In the business press, in the boardroom, in the executive suites, the focus was always on performance, strategy, results, never on something as subjective as happiness. Elizabeth considered the question seriously. The past 6 months had been the most demanding of her life. She had worked 16-hour days, faced down skeptical investors, restructured major divisions of the company, and made decisions affecting thousands of employees. She had weathered media scrutiny and industry gossip. She had dismantled the remnants of Maxwell's regime and built something new in its place. But through it all, she had been herself, completely and unapologetically herself, for the first time in decades. Yes, she said finally, the word both simple and profound. I am. 1 year to the day after the fateful wedding at Greystone Manor, Elizabeth Morgan stood at the podium in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Economic Club. The irony of the venue was not lost on her. Maxwell had often delivered speeches from this very spot, basking in the adulation of his peers. Now it was her turn, but under vastly different circumstances. She had been invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Women in Business Leadership Summit, an event that had gained significant prominence in recent years. The audience was a sea of faces, predominantly women, but with a healthy representation of men as well. CEOs, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, journalists, and students filled the rows, all there to hear from the woman whose corporate coup had become a business school case study. 1 year ago today, Elizabeth began, her voice calm and measured. I stood up at a very different event and revealed a truth that had been hidden for 2 decades. The aftermath of that moment has been called many things: a revenge story, a cautionary tale, a feminist triumph, a calculated business maneuver. She paused, looking out at the rapt audience. In reality, it was all of those things and none of them. What happened that day was simply the culmination of a long-term strategy meeting a perfect moment of opportunity. It's what happens in boardrooms and trading floors every day. Except this time, the protagonist didn't look like what people expected power to look like. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. The questions I've been asked most frequently this past year all center around the how. How did I acquire the shares without detection? How did I time the announcement? How did I prepare for the aftermath? But the more important question, the one that should concern everyone in this room is, why? Elizabeth stepped out from behind the podium, choosing to walk the stage as she continued. Why was it necessary for a qualified, knowledgeable woman to operate in the shadows for 20 years rather than being recognized for her contributions? Why was I dismissed as the wife rather than seen as a business partner? Why did my ideas need to be filtered through a male voice to be heard? She let the questions hang in the air for a moment. The answer is as old as commerce itself. We have inherited systems that were not built by us or for us. Systems that mistake confidence for competence, volume for value, and aggression for leadership. My ex-husband didn't create these systems, but he benefited from them, as have countless others. Elizabeth's gaze swept across the room, making eye contact with the young women in the audience, the future leaders watching her with hopeful intensity. My story has been framed as one of revenge, but I prefer to see it as one of correction, a correction of an imbalance, a restoration of meritocracy, a reclamation of value. She moved back to the podium, turning to the final page of her speech. The true measure of the change I hope to see won't be in how many women occupy corner offices or boardroom seats, though those numbers matter. It will be in how those women get there, not through decades of shadow operations and strategic patience, but through direct recognition of their abilities and contributions. Elizabeth closed her folder and looked up at the audience one last time. I stand before you today not as someone who defeated a man, but as someone who created a better company, not as a victim who got even, but as a leader who drove value, not as an exception to the rule, but, I hope, as a harbinger of a new normal. Thank you. The applause was immediate and thunderous. As Elizabeth made her way off the stage, she was met by Regina Palmer, who had become both a business partner and a friend over the past year. That was magnificent, Regina said, embracing her. You've given them something to think about beyond the drama. Let's hope so, Elizabeth replied. I'm tired of being a cautionary tale. I'd rather be a case study in effective leadership. Later that evening, Elizabeth returned to her penthouse, not the sterile showpiece she had shared with Maxwell, but a new space she had chosen and designed herself. It was on the 40th floor of a historic building overlooking Lake Michigan, filled with warmth, art, and books. It was a home, not a statement. She kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine, carrying it out to the terrace. The Chicago skyline glittered before her, a constellation of lights against the darkening sky. Somewhere out there was Maxwell, living his diminished life. She rarely thought of him now. He had become irrelevant to her story. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister in Boston. Saw clips of your speech online. Standing ovation in our living room, too. So proud of you. Liz, Elizabeth smiled. Her relationship with her family had blossomed over the past year, freed from the constraints of Maxwell's social calendar and expectations. She had rediscovered parts of herself that had been set aside during her marriage, her love of classical music, her interest in historical biographies, her passion for sailing on Lake Michigan. She had also, somewhat to her surprise, developed new friendships, real ones, not the strategic social alliances of her previous life. Regina was one, Diane Foster, her PR director, was another. Even Sophia Chen, the Forbes journalist, had become a regular lunch companion, their initial professional relationship evolving into mutual respect and genuine connection. There had been interest from men as well, discreet inquiries, careful invitations. Elizabeth had declined them all, not out of bitterness or distrust, but because she was, for the first time in her adult life, completely self-sufficient. Her time was her own, her decisions were her own, her life was her own. It was a freedom she was in no hurry to compromise. The evening breeze carried the faint sounds of the city up to her terrace traffic. Music, the distant horn of a boat on the lake. Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting it all wash over her. This was her kingdom now, built not through marriage or manipulation, but through patience, intelligence, and the quiet accumulation of power. In the end, Elizabeth Morgan hadn't just reclaimed her life from Maxwell Williams, she had created an entirely new one that had always been waiting for her to step into it. The Silent Queen had found her voice, and it turned out to be more powerful than anyone, perhaps even Elizabeth herself, had ever imagined. What do you think of Elizabeth's masterful plan? Was her revenge justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of epic revenge and empowerment, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that are stranger and more compelling than fiction. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update from us. Remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. Sometimes the person you underestimate is the one who will ultimately redefine the game. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes not in the form of a dramatic confrontation, but in the patient, methodical execution of a plan 20 years in the making. Elizabeth Morgan didn't just get even, she got everything. Thunder cracked like gunfire over Manhattan's jagged skyline, shaking the glass of Aurora Kensington's penthouse window. She stood motionless, a lone figure draped in silk and fury, her silhouette carved by lightning as storm winds howled around the towering spires of the city below. Her heart thundered louder than the storm, fists clenched so tightly her knuckles ached. She hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not when every minute that ticked by felt like a countdown to betrayal. At 5 months pregnant, the weight of her unborn child was the only anchor tethering her to sanity, because Lazarus Kensington, her billionaire husband, was nowhere to be found. Again. The storm outside was chaos, but inside her soul, it was a hurricane. Her phone lit up one last time, delivering the final dagger, photos from Sabrina Townsend. Crisp, undeniable. Lazarus wrapped in the arms of a statuesque blonde at a midtown lounge, grinning like sin incarnate. The same Lazarus who had fed her sweet lies about late-night meetings with foreign investors. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred, but not from tears. No, Aurora had already cried the last tear she would ever shed for that man. She placed a trembling hand over her belly, her voice a whisper of steel. "You deserve better, little one. We both do." The front door creaked open. It was nearly dawn. Lazarus entered, soaked and disheveled, the storm clinging to him like guilt. His tailored suit dripped water onto the marble floor, but it was the scent that hit first. An intoxicating mix of expensive perfume that did not belong to her. Aurora didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes were frozen fire. "Tough meeting?" she asked, her voice calm. Too calm. Lazarus hesitated, his mouth twitching toward another lie. But before he could speak, Aurora stepped forward and slapped a thick envelope against his chest. His hand came up to steady it. His eyes scanned the words. Divorce, full custody, assets frozen. "You're not the only one who's been making deal," she said coldly. "Mine just happened to be legally binding." Lightning flashed. Thunder detonated overhead. For the first time since she'd known him, Lazarus Kensington looked afraid. Not of losing her, but of losing control. And it was already gone. Aurora turned away, her back straight, her strength carved from heartbreak. This wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a reckoning. For her child, and for the man who thought she'd never have the power to walk away. Aurora wasn't always part of Manhattan's elite. Born and raised in a small Pennsylvania town, she grew up surrounded by rolling farmland and neighbors who knew one another's middle names. Even as a teenager, she'd harbored ambitions that soared beyond the horizon of her rural upbringing. Scholarships and straight-A grades carried her to an Ivy League education, and from there, she catapulted into an internship at a high-stakes investment firm in New York City. That's when she first crossed paths with Lazarus Kensington, a self-made billionaire whose real estate empire was growing faster than gossip could travel. He was magnetic, exuding confidence in every handshake and every carefully pitched investment proposal. Aurora's first encounter with him had been at a charity benefit. She was volunteering at the check-in booth, scanning the invitations of Manhattan's glittering aristocrats, while Lazarus was an invited speaker slated to discuss philanthropic contributions. He breezed in with an entourage of assistants and corporate partners, But somehow his gaze anchored on Aurora's. Their first conversation was a dance of witty banter. He asked about her background, impressed by her incisive intelligence. Days later, a bouquet of white lilies arrived at her tiny studio apartment with a note, "Dinner this Saturday, LK." She fell in love quickly, swept off her feet by lavish dates in hidden gem restaurants, late-night walks through the city streets, and Lazarus's unwavering attention whenever they were together. Even his marriage proposal arrived like a fairy tale. A private dinner at a rooftop garden, violinists softly playing in the background, the ring hidden under her dessert plate. Their wedding was a highlight in Manhattan society pages, two rising stars uniting in a sumptuous ceremony. For a while, it felt like they lived inside an invincible bubble of love and ambition. But cracks soon appeared, signaled by Lazarus's unpredictable hours and networking events that seemed less about business and more about reveling in the city's nightlife. Aurora chalked it up to his unstoppable drive. She wanted to believe in him, to believe that a powerful man sometimes carried the burden of extraordinary responsibilities. It wasn't until she discovered that she was pregnant that the whispers transformed into undeniable truths. A quick check-in. Are you feeling Aurora's whirlwind of emotions? If you're with her so far, drop a 1 in the comments. If you're skeptical about Lazarus's motives, drop a 2. Let's keep going. Aurora had envisioned motherhood as a luminous new chapter in her life. Days of picking out baby clothes, decorating a nursery, and basking in the excited support of her husband. Yet as her belly grew, Lazarus drifted further away. Nights stretched into early mornings. Phone calls went unanswered, and the perfume on his suits was never hers. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was chasing yet another deal, sinking his energy into a new development project that would secure their child's future. But the evidence contradicting such hopeful illusions piled up. Subtle lipstick stains on collars, evasive answers about weekend business trips, credit card statements listing clubs and bars she had never set foot in. Now, with tears threatening to blur her vision, Aurora remembered the early days of her pregnancy. He'd seemed thrilled, at least initially, placing a gentle hand on her stomach and whispering how they'd raise a child to appreciate both the hustle of the city and the importance of humility. She clung to that memory, wanting so desperately for it to be the truth of who Lazarus was. But the harsh reality forced her to see him for what he had become, a man consumed by the siren call of wealth and admirers who fed his ego. It took a long, sleepless night for Aurora to decide she was done living in illusions. She packed a small overnight bag, contacted her closest friend, Delilah Chang, one of the few people who truly had her back in this city of bright lights and darker secrets, and asked for a place to stay. Then she instructed her lawyer to draw up the divorce papers. The confrontation in the penthouse, culminating in Lazarus's stunned expression, played over and over in her mind. Part of her wanted him to kneel in regret, to beg forgiveness and swear absolute devotion. The other part of her recognized that no matter what he did, the foundation of their marriage was cracked beyond repair. Standing in the foyer after handing him that envelope, Aurora felt the baby kick. It was as if the little life inside her was reminding her that she needed to be strong, no matter how her heart quaked. Rain pelted against the tall windows, matching the tears Aurora fought to suppress. Lazarus gripped the envelope, speechless for a moment. His striking features, a chiseled jaw, dark hair slicked back with expensive product, contorted into a mask of disbelief. "Aurora, wait," he sputtered. "We can't just—" But she lifted a trembling hand to silence him. "I won't let our child grow up watching me beg for respect," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever you've done, and I have a good idea of it, our marriage ends here." She brushed past him toward the elevator, ignoring the pang in her chest that once would have made her hesitate, turn around, forgive. As the elevator doors slid shut, she glimpsed Lazarus slumping against the penthouse's marble counter, the storm still raging outside and a certain emptiness settling over his eyes. For a heartbeat, she almost believed he was genuinely remorseful. But memories of countless broken promises hardened her resolve. It was time to leave, to reclaim her dignity. Delilah's apartment in the Upper West Side was nothing like Aurora's luxurious penthouse. It was cozy, cluttered with mismatched furniture and half-finished art projects. But to Aurora, it felt like a safe haven. Delilah, her luminous curly hair framing a face of perpetual concern, ushered Aurora in with an outpouring of sympathy. She set Aurora up in a spare bedroom, offering cups of chamomile tea and heartfelt assurances that everything would eventually work out. While Delilah handled the awkward hush that followed her roommate's wide-eyed stare, apparently not everyone was used to hosting a billionaire's wife overnight, Aurora sank into the couch, exhaustion weighing her down. For the first time in a year, she managed a faint smile, even through the tears. "Thank you for letting me stay," Aurora said, voice quivering. Delilah responded with a gentle squeeze of Aurora's hand. "Hey, you're family to me. Always." Outside, the rain continued pounding, as if Manhattan itself was lamenting the disintegration of Aurora's marriage. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant rumble of thunder and the hiss of traffic. In her mind, she kept replaying that final scene. Lazarus, standing alone with legal papers in his grasp, an empire of glass around him that might shatter under the weight of his betrayal. The next morning arrived with crisp sunlight slicing through the window, the storm's remnants visible in scattered puddles, and a lingering dampness in the air. Aurora woke in Delilah's spare room with a start, her heart pounding from a restless dream about a child crying in an empty penthouse. She placed a palm on her belly, whispering quiet reassurances. Whatever else happened, she vowed, she would make this child's life stable and filled with love. Delilah insisted they have a hearty breakfast. Over fresh coffee and scrambled eggs, Aurora's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages she dreaded checking. She finally mustered the courage, reading Lazarus's texts, apologies in various forms, from voice notes to paragraphs claiming he only strayed because of immense stress. He blamed the real estate world's pressure, the paparazzi chasing him after big deals, and the socialites clinging to him at exclusive events. It stung to see him grovel, but Aurora reminded herself that words alone couldn't patch the cracks he'd inflicted on her heart. Turning off her phone, she turned to Delilah. "I need a new plan," she said, voice low but determined. "This baby deserves security. I can't keep drifting." Delilah nodded. "You know, you'll need an attorney who can stand toe-to-toe with Lazarus's legal team if it escalates. Marian Delgado's good, but is she ready for the fight? Lazarus might try to wrap things up in his favor." Aurora sipped her coffee, the warmth giving her momentary comfort. She'd met Marian Delgado through a friend of a friend, quickly assessing her competence. Marian was tough, specializing in high-asset divorces. "I trust her," Aurora replied. "She's meticulous and she understands what's at stake. I just need to gather more evidence. Bank statements, proof of infidelity, so we can negotiate from a place of strength." Delilah reached across the table, her expression kind. "I'll help however I can. Just tell me what you need." "Before we move forward, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you think Aurora is making the right choice by cutting ties now, share your perspective in the comments. And if you believe Lazarus can truly change, let's see a show of optimism." Determined to begin the process formally, Aurora arranged a meeting with Marian Delgado that afternoon. Delilah accompanied her for moral support, and they arrived at Delgado and Associates, a modern high-rise law office with gleaming glass walls and a reputation for handling cases of the rich and restless. Marian greeted them with a firm handshake, ushering them into her spacious office overlooking the frenetic streets of Midtown. Marian's demeanor was calm but unyielding, just the sort of energy Aurora needed. "Let's talk strategy," the lawyer began, sliding a notepad forward. "We'll file on grounds of irreconcilable differences and adultery, focusing on the well-being of your unborn child as a critical priority. I'll push for spousal support, child support, and possibly the exclusive right to the penthouse, if that's something you want." Aurora inhaled sharply at the mention of the penthouse. The place was full of memories, both good and bad. "I'm not sure I even want to stay there," she murmured, glancing at Delilah for reassurance. "I feel haunted. But maybe it's better to have it until the baby's born, for stability's sake." Marian nodded. "We don't have to finalize that decision right now. Just know you have leverage. Lazarus's public image matters to him. He'll likely do a lot to avoid a scandal." The conversation then turned to evidence. Aurora had screenshots of social media sightings, messages forwarded from friends, and credit card statements that placed Lazarus in suspicious venues at suspicious hours. She handed a folder to Marian, heart pounding. This was real now, not just an angry impulse. "I hate airing this dirty laundry," she said, voice tight, "but I need to protect myself." Marion gave her a sympathetic smile. "Divorce is never pleasant, especially high-profile ones, but your priority is your child and securing your future." After they wrapped up the consultation, Aurora stepped out into the corridor feeling a mix of dread and relief. The die was cast. There would be no turning back once the petition was filed. She clutched her belly gently, remembering the flutter of tiny movements, a reminder of why she had to see this through. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, oblivious to her personal upheaval. Aurora hailed a cab with Delilah, heart heavy yet resolute, ready to face whatever Lazarus Kensington had in store. Rumors spread like wildfire in Manhattan's elite circles. Whispers of the Kensington marriage crumbling surfaced at upscale lounges, exclusive charity galas, even in the hushed corners of high-end boutiques. Aurora tried to block out the chatter, focusing instead on the practicalities of her new life. She moved more belongings to Delilah's apartment, transferring basic necessities and baby items she'd begun collecting over the last few months. Each box felt like a step away from the illusions that once formed her daily reality. One afternoon, she received a call from her mother, who still lived in Pennsylvania. Concern permeated her mother's every word as she demanded to know what was happening. Aurora had told her mother bits and pieces, but never the full story. Now she tried to be honest without delving into graphic detail. There were tears on both ends of the line, her mother's voice breaking when she realized her daughter's life was so painfully off course. "Come home if you need to," her mother pleaded. "We'll figure it all out." Aurora appreciated the support, but felt torn. The city was her home now. She'd built a career here, relationships, and a plan for the future. Would it make sense to retreat to quiet farmland, leaving behind everything she'd established? The question hovered without a neat answer. Meanwhile, Lazarus's attempts to reach her grew more persistent. He left voicemails apologizing for one slip-up, though Aurora knew it hadn't been a single moment of weakness. He sent extravagant flower arrangements to Delilah's place, which only caused tension with Delilah's roommate, who joked that their small living room was turning into a florist's warehouse. Aurora remained unmoved. Her unborn child's next checkup approached, and as she considered going alone, she received a text from Lazarus. "Please let me be at the appointment. I want to support you." She stared at the message, heart twisting. If she denied him, was she letting her anger overshadow the chance for the baby to have a father? If she let him come, was she risking more emotional manipulation? Where do you think Aurora should draw the line? Let us know in the comments if you'd keep him away or if you'd give him a chance to show he cares. Every viewpoint matters. Against her better judgment, Aurora agreed to let Lazarus attend the prenatal appointment. She reasoned that their child deserved at least a semblance of a father's involvement, and a medical checkup was hardly an intimate reconciliation. When she arrived at the OBGYN's office, she felt anxiety spike as she spotted Lazarus waiting in the corridor, wearing a carefully tailored suit that seemed a sharp contrast to the pastel surroundings. His eyes locked on hers with an odd mixture of shame and determination. They barely spoke in the waiting room. The air around them felt charged like the moment before lightning strikes. Eventually, the nurse called Aurora's name, and Lazarus trailed behind, hands clasped, mouth drawn into a tight line. Inside the examination room, the doctor greeted them politely, smiling at Lazarus's presence. Aurora wondered if she suspected the tension swirling beneath the polite veneer. When the ultrasound began, that familiar, miraculous sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. Aurora felt her eyes grow misty with wonder. Even Lazarus's stoic facade cracked. His mouth parted slightly and tears rimmed his eyes. In a moment that felt both tender and heartbreaking, she saw genuine emotions surface in him, something she'd begun to doubt he was capable of. He reached for her hand. She hesitated, but the baby's heartbeat pulsed through the machine like a tiny drum. For just an instant, Aurora let him take her hand, allowing herself to feel the warmth of his palm. She remembered the dream they once had, a family, a life built together. Then the intrusion of memory, lipstick stains, expensive perfume, nights spent with someone else, shattered the fragile moment. She withdrew her hand as the doctor finished the scan. The ride down the elevator afterward was silent. At the hospital exit, Lazarus turned to her. I know I can't fix what I did, he whispered, but I'm going to try. I want to be a part of this child's life, Aurora, however you'll allow it. She simply nodded, her lips pressed in a firm line. The divorce was still moving forward, and no amount of remorse in a doctor's office could erase the betrayal that had set this tragedy into motion. Filing the papers felt surreal. Aurora sat in Marian Delgado's office, meticulously reviewing every clause in the divorce petition. Marian's direct yet reassuring guidance had been invaluable. The papers cited irreconcilable differences in Lazarus's infidelity, outlining provisions for spousal support, child support, and protection for Aurora's emotional well-being during pregnancy. Aurora's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name, but her resolve remained unwavering. Outside the firm's tall glass windows, Manhattan glittered as though offering a cruel juxtaposition to the heartbreak inside the office. The city soared on, oblivious to broken vows and shattered trust. Once the documents were officially filed, a wave of complicated relief washed over Aurora. She had taken a stand, refusing to let Lazarus's betrayal define her life. And yet, she couldn't ignore the swirl of regret, sadness, and vestigial love that lingered in her chest. Over the ensuing days, Lazarus's legal team responded. Marian forwarded the briefs, which contained counteroffers, lower spousal support, joint custody from birth, and an attempt to retain the penthouse as a shared marital asset. Reading those proposals, Aurora's pulse quickened in anger. Did Lazarus truly expect her to raise a newborn under the same roof as him, after all the lies? Or was it simply a strategy to ensure he looked magnanimous in court? Late one evening, Marian called with news of a mandatory mediation session. It was the court's way of encouraging settlement before dragging everything into a full trial. Aurora dreaded the idea of sitting across from Lazarus in a small conference room, dissecting the wreckage of their relationship in legal jargon. But if it helped her secure a stable future for the baby, she would do it. Delilah, who'd become her pillar of support, reminded her to stay strong. He'll try to play on your emotions, she cautioned. Remember why you're doing this? Aurora nodded, feeling a fierce protective surge for the child inside her. She closed her eyes that night, replaying the ultrasound's steady heartbeat in her mind. No matter how the negotiations panned out, she refused to let her child grow in an environment of broken promises. Mediation took place in a plush, neutral-toned office with abstract art on the walls and a rectangular glass table at the center. Aurora arrived with Marian, each of them carrying files. On the opposite side sat Lazarus and his attorney. He wore a measured expression, bordering on contrite. Aurora's heart hammered as she took her seat. The mediator, a gray-haired professional named Yvonne Sellers, began by explaining that this was an opportunity to find a middle ground. Marian opened with Aurora's requests: full custody until the child was at least a year old, with supervised visitation for Lazarus, substantial child support, and a fair distribution of marital assets. Lazarus's attorney countered, emphasizing how Lazarus sought equal involvement in their baby's life and a less burdensome alimony arrangement. Aurora bit her lip as Lazarus spoke. He admitted to a lapse in judgment and expressed regret, but also insisted that he still cared for Aurora's well-being and wanted to co-parent effectively. Hearing those words out loud, Aurora felt a twinge of sadness. This was the man she'd once adored, whose ring she wore with pride, whose future she had planned to share. The hours crawled by as both sides volleyed proposals and concessions. Yvonne Sellers took copious notes, occasionally stepping in to reframe an argument or highlight a potential compromise. Tensions ran high. At one point, Lazarus snapped, claiming that Aurora was trying to bankrupt him in retaliation. Aurora's cheeks burned, but Marian calmly refuted the accusation, pointing to Lazarus's substantial net worth and brand partnerships that dwarfed any spousal support figure they were discussing. Eventually, Lazarus asked to speak directly to Aurora, and the mediator permitted a short exchange. "I never wanted this," he said, voice cracking. "I got swept up. I know that sounds like an excuse, but I promise you, Aurora, I loved you. Maybe I still do." Aurora swallowed hard. "You loved me so much that you destroyed my trust," she replied quietly, each word brimming with the hurt she carried. "I'm here to protect our child. That's what matters." Haprashi, if you're still reading, let us know. Do you think Lazarus's remorse is real or just another tactic? Comment yes if you believe him, No if you suspect he's faking it. Thanks for sticking with this intense journey. Weeks passed in a blur of court filings, phone calls, and restless nights. Aurora's pregnancy advanced, bringing new challenges, aches in her lower back, bouts of fatigue that forced her to slow down, and a swirl of prenatal emotions that sometimes made her cry without warning. Amid all this, she tried to carve out small moments of peace, taking short walks in Central Park or reading parenting books that offered glimpses of the joy ahead. Lazarus continued attending some of her prenatal checkups, always under the watchful eye of Aurora and her doctors. He displayed a gentler side in these medical settings, never pressing her with personal pleas, just asking about the baby's progress. Occasionally, Aurora caught him gazing at her with a sadness that echoed her own, but she reminded herself of the betrayal that led them here. Meanwhile, the mediation sessions gradually yielded an agreement in principle. Lazarus would pay a fair monthly child support sum and provide Aurora with a modest but comfortable alimony for 3 years. She would retain temporary residence at the penthouse, at least until the baby turned 6 months old, after which they would sell it and split the proceeds. In return, Lazarus requested joint legal custody, meaning he wanted to help make decisions about the child's education, health care, and overall welfare. Aurora's stomach churned at the notion. Could she truly share such critical decisions with a man whose trust she couldn't rely on? But Marion advised that given Lazarus's resources and potential for a prolonged court battle, this might be the best outcome she could secure without extended litigation. The final step before the official court hearing loomed. Aurora felt a swirl of dread and relief. She wanted the marriage to be formally over, yet the weight of finality pressed heavily on her chest. Some nights, she dreamed of a past filled with happier times, dancing with Lazarus in their living room, celebrating his first big real estate acquisition, or discovering their baby's heartbeat for the first time. Waking from such dreams was agonizing, the realization that those moments were now irretrievable. On the morning of the divorce hearing, Aurora rose early, her heart thrumming with tension. She opted for a simple black maternity dress, wanting to project calm resolve rather than heartbreak or vulnerability. Delilah gave her a tight hug and wished her luck before Aurora headed out. The crisp autumn air outside felt sharper than usual, slicing through her coat as she stood on the sidewalk, flagging down a taxi. When she arrived at the courthouse, photographers were already stationed near the entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of the high-profile couple. Cameras flashed in her direction. She shielded her face, ignoring the barrage of shouted questions. Aurora, do you blame Lazarus? Will you fight for full custody? Are you reconciling? Security ushered her inside, where Marion was waiting with a reassuring nod. Lazarus and his attorney arrived moments later. He looked composed yet visibly weary, dark circles under his eyes hinting at sleepless nights. They didn't speak as they walked into the courtroom, but Aurora sensed the unspoken tension crackling between them. This was it, the final stage of the dissolution. The judge, a stern-looking woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, reviewed their case file. She asked if both parties were satisfied with the settlement terms presented. Marion answered affirmatively for Aurora, while Lazarus's attorney did the same. The judge examined the documents carefully and then addressed Aurora, who stood with her hands protectively over her belly. Mrs. Kensington, the judge began formally, you understand that by signing this settlement, you agree to the custody, alimony, and property distribution outlined? Yes, Your Honor, Aurora replied, her voice resonating with a composure she didn't fully feel. Mr. Kensington, the judge continued, you also understand these terms? I do, Lazarus said quietly, glancing at Aurora, and I accept them. With that, the judge announced the dissolution of their marriage. The gavel's echo resonated through the silent courtroom, finalizing what felt both surreal and painfully tangible. Aurora's stomach twisted, the baby fluttering as though sensing the emotional significance of the moment. When they exited into the corridor, Lazarus tried to speak to her, but she merely shook her head. They had said everything they could say, and now there was nothing left but to move forward. A flood of relief, sorrow, and unexpected liberation washed over Aurora in the days following the final decree. She returned to Delilah's apartment, exhaling a breath she felt she'd been holding for months. The storm of lawyers, negotiations, and mediations had finally subsided, leaving an odd stillness in its wake. In that stillness, Aurora began to piece herself back together. She scheduled a counseling session for herself, an individual appointment with a recommended therapist who specialized in helping women navigate divorce and single parenthood. Though she felt uncertain about opening up to a stranger, she knew she needed to address the deep hurt and resentment before she brought her child into the world. Lazarus kept to the terms of the agreement. He paid the initial installments of support without protest, and his messages to Aurora became strictly about the baby. Medical updates, potential schedules for him to attend future checkups, and offers to help with any expenses. Part of Aurora was relieved by his newly respectful tone. Another part of her had trouble reconciling this cooperative father figure with the man who had snuck out for clandestine affairs. Still, the knowledge that she would eventually have to co-parent with him loomed on the horizon. She couldn't block him out forever, not when their child had a right to know their father. Yet she was determined to set boundaries that protected her own mental and emotional well-being. Sometimes, late at night, she found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. A smiling Lazarus hugging her waist as they posed in front of some skyscraper he'd acquired. Or the two of them celebrating her pregnancy announcement at a high-end restaurant. Each picture was a reminder of what could have been, and also a stark illustration of how a relationship could deteriorate when trust dissolved. Viewers, have you ever had to rebuild your life after heartbreak? Share your experience in the comments. Your story might encourage someone else who's struggling. And if you're rooting for Aurora's fresh start, hit that like button. A month passed. Aurora finally felt ready to move some of her belongings from the penthouse to a smaller, more manageable apartment that she'd rented in a quieter Brooklyn neighborhood. She chose a cozy two-bedroom unit with sunlight streaming in each morning, located near a park where she imagined strolling with her baby. The old penthouse was scheduled to be sold once the baby reached 6 months, per the settlement, and she'd be allowed to stay there temporarily. But the space held too many ghosts. She returned one last time, accompanied by Delilah for emotional support. They walked through the marble foyer, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The city view still dazzled, but Aurora noticed how sterile it felt now, like a showpiece rather than a home. She retrieved photo albums, cherished books, and a few sentimental items, leaving behind the furniture and decor Lazarus had selected. Her heart clenched as she closed the door on that chapter, the final echo of a dream she once cherished. The next day, she settled into her new place, positioning the crib in what would be the baby's room, placing soft blankets and little stuffed animals on the bed. It wasn't as opulent as the penthouse, but it felt warm, personal, and free of the tension that had weighed her down for too long. When she finally rested on the living room couch, the baby kicked, and she smiled despite tears brimming in her eyes. She recognized the swirl of emotions as part sorrow for what was lost, part excitement for what lay ahead. Over time, Aurora began crafting a vision for the future, exploring career opportunities that offered flexibility, attending prenatal yoga classes, and deepening her connections with supportive friends. She and Lazarus navigated a cautious rapport, exchanging updates about the pregnancy. He still asked to attend doctor's appointments when possible, and she allowed it, though her boundaries remained firm. In many ways, this ending was also a beginning, a chance for Aurora to forge a life that didn't hinge on someone else's neglect or approval. The heartbreak was real, but so was her resilience. She was determined to raise her child in an environment built on self-respect, honesty, and a fierce commitment to thriving beyond betrayal. Thank you for immersing yourself in Aurora's journey, from the height of a seemingly perfect billionaire marriage to the hard-won emergence of a strong, independent mother-to-be. If this story kept you turning pages, please tap the like button and share your thoughts or personal experiences in the comments. Where are you reading or watching from? We'd love to know. Your feedback keeps us going and helps us bring more empowering stories to life.